It's a very sad situation. It's a very bad situation, and we want to get to the bottom of it.
Do you think he's guilty?
I don't want to say that. I hope he's not. I hope he's not.
Hold the Saudi government responsible.
Well, I have to find out who did it, but people saw him go in, but they didn't see him come out, as they understand it, and we're going to take a very serious look at it. It's a terrible thing. This is a bad situation. We cannot let this happen. To reporters, to anybody, we can't let this happen, and we're going to get to the bottom of it.
Do you have a message to the Saudi government? Are you demanding information?
Yeah, we are. We're demanding everything. We want to see what's going on here. That's a bad situation. And frankly, the fact that it's a reporter, you could say in many respects it brings it to a level. It's a very serious situation for us and for this White House. We do not like seeing what's going on.
President Trump in the Oval Office yesterday speaking to reporters about missing journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who walked into the Saudi Arabian consulate in Turkey more than a week ago and has not been seen since. The Washington Post reports that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS, personally ordered an operation to lure Khashoggi from his home in Virginia back to Saudi Arabia and then to capture him. That's according to U.S. officials familiar with intelligence intercepts of Saudi officials discussing that plan. Khashoggi was a prominent vocal critic of the Crown Prince. NBC News has had no access to the reported intercepts, and U.S. intelligence officials have not commented. The Washington Post reports advances reporting from the New York Times earlier in the week, stating that senior Turkish officials have concluded that an assassination came on, quote, orders from the highest levels of the royal court. Saudi Arabia has denied the claims and says Khashoggi left the consulate. Join us now, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, and the co-host of Morning Joe First Look, Ayman Moeldin, joining the conversation as well. Good morning to you both. Senator, let me start with you. Do you have any further information on what exactly U.S. intelligence knows here about what may have happened to Jamal Khashoggi?
Well, I certainly don't have information that I can share. What I can say is that we are all very concerned that the Saudis have been unable to offer any proof that this did not happen. And for any of us that have spent time in consulates or embassies overseas, we know that every single one of these embassies have cameras that are connected to taping systems. There is no way, in my mind, that the Saudis wouldn't be able to easily offer proof that Jamal Khashoggi left that embassy. They've been unwilling to do that. You partner that together with the open source reporting regarding the Turks' relative certainty that they have enough evidence to suggest that this was ultimately a murder, perhaps a very gruesome, grisly murder inside. And it's time for the Congress and the president to, get beyond just talking about being concerned and starting to do something about it.
Can I ask it another way then, Senator? Do you have any reason to believe that Jamal Khashoggi is alive?
I don't.
Senator, what's the impact if the Crown Prince, the leader of Saudi Arabia, MBS, actually did plot this out, send 15 of his thugs to Saudi Arabia and killed a Washington Post columnist and a U.S. resident on foreign soil? What is the impact for U.S.-Saudi relations?
So this is part of a much broader, brutal crackdown that Mohammed bin Salman is undertaking against those who oppose his regime. He's jailed his own family members. He has jailed prominent women's rights advocates. He is engaged in large-scale executions. And so we need to be very concerned about what's happening inside the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But we are also engaged in a very disastrous military partnership with them inside Yemen today that is predicated on us believing the Saudis that they are not intentionally trying to kill civilians inside Yemen, where the United States is helping them bomb. Given the fact that they may be lying to our face about what happened inside this consulate in Turkey, why on earth should we continue to believe them that they aren't targeting civilians with bombs inside Yemen when all of the evidence tells us that they are, just as most of the evidence we've seen thus far tells us that they did kill Jamal Khashoggi. So I think it really calls into question whether we should continue in this partnership with them inside the civil war in Yemen that has, by the way, killed about 10,000 Yemenis over the course of the bombing campaign.
Any concern right now how close of a relationship the president and Jared Kushner have, both of them together? to MBS, and that close relationship may actually stop justice from being done to a Washington Post columnist who may have been lured into an embassy, killed, and then had his body hacked to little pieces.
Well, add to that this reporting that I don't have any independent confirmation of that suggests Mohammed bin Salman was telling a bunch of people around him that Jared Kushner was sharing with him classified intelligence that he was receiving in briefs with the president regarding some of the most vocal opponents of Mohammed bin Salman, maybe giving him tips as to who to go after. So, listen, there is clearly some underlying reason for this this very close relationship between the Trump family and the Saudi royal family. Why was it the president's first visit of his administration to Saudi Arabia, something that no foreign policy advisor would have recommended? Maybe there are business interests there. Maybe there are campaign finance connections. But we've also got to get to the bottom of that story as to why this administration has been so unconditionally supportive of a brutal regime that is ultimately making our national security weaker in the conduct of this war inside Yemen, and now is going after U.S. residents.
Well, Senator, you talked about reports that Jared Kushner may have been sharing information about opponents of that regime. A bigger question right now this morning after reports yesterday that the intel community knew of a possible plot. Isn't it important to find out what did our intelligence communities know? When did they know it? What did the president or Jared Kushner or the White House know, and when did they know it? And did they send any warnings, as they are required by a 2015 law, to Khashoggi himself to let him know that he may be endangered?
Yeah, I think these are really important questions. If it is true that U.S. intelligence knew that the Saudis were trying to track him down and trying to kidnap him, why on earth did they allow him to go to a Saudi consulate or to go to Turkey, where he was likely to go to a Saudi consulate? Remember, he fled Saudi Arabia to come to the United States. Now, he wasn't here as a political refugee, but he was a high-profile critic of the Saudi government. It would have been very easy for the Trump administration to reach out to him and tell him that he should maybe stay here instead of going over to the consulate. And we have some serious questions to answer as to why they didn't do that, if they knew that he was under threat of arrest or potentially under threat of physical harm.
So, Eamon, what are the cross currents here, as Senator Murphy's been talking about them, not just with the Trump family's relationship and Jared Kushner's relationship with the Crown Prince, but the long-standing relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia? If it's proven that Saudi Arabia ordered the killing of a Washington Post columnist who's a legal resident of Virginia, what are the real-world implications of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got a glimpse of that last night with President Trump in his interview. He was asked about this, and in fact, his response was when he was asked specifically, senators and the bipartisan talk about possibly imposing sanctions on Saudi Arabia, or at least blocking the arms deal. His response was very blunt. He said that would be a tough pill to swallow. We have a lot of things happening in this country. He defaulted to the economic positions that Saudi Arabia buys billions of dollars worth of weapons, and that translates into jobs and a boost into the American economy. That was the president speaking last night when he was asked about the possibility of a high-risk assassination attempt by the Saudis on somebody that was living here in the United States. So I think it kind of puts in perspective how the White House, how others view the Saudi relationship with the United States. It's not just economic. We know there's a long-standing intelligence and security sharing, but something like this, I think, at least from what we're hearing initially, is going to really rattle the foundations of that relationship. Some people said, you know, if the U.S. didn't criticize Saudi Arabia after 9/11 and didn't put a lot of pressure on the Saudis then, we are now entering a whole new level of territory in that relationship.
We've got some new reporting on this story just this morning. NBC News reporting Jamal Khashoggi checked his cell phone just before entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last week, but never read messages sent to him minutes later. This according to screenshots obtained by NBC News. Joining us with more on that report, national political reporter Josh Lederman. Josh, good morning. What more can you tell us?
Well, this text messages that have been obtained by NBC News really corroborate the timeline of the disappearance of Mr. Khashoggi, and they also provide further evidence that after he entered the consulate, he did not leave like the Saudis have been claiming. Now, these are text messages that were sent from a friend of Mr. Khashoggi who lives in the United States to him while he was in Istanbul. We know there was a text message that was sent the night before, and these are through the encrypted messaging app WhatsApp. And if you've ever used WhatsApp, you know that messages will show check marks next to them. And if they're gray, it means the messages have not been read. And if they're blue, it means they have been read. The night before, they had been read. And it also shows that as of 1:06 p.m. in Istanbul, Mr. Khashoggi had checked his phone. He'd been online using WhatsApp. Only 8 minutes later, he entered the consulate, according to the time frame that's included on the CCTV image that you're looking at right now of him walking into the consulate. So 1:14, he enters the consulate, and then another text message sent just about 10 minutes later to him was never read. It has those gray marks showing that he did not have them. So for the Saudis claiming that he entered the consulate and then left and was fine when he left, there are no indications from these text messages that once he was unable to see his phone after entering the consulate that he ever got access to that phone again.
And one other wrinkle to add in here, we talked about it yesterday, but Senator Bob Corker, Republican, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, said he talked to the Saudi ambassador about getting the videotapes that allegedly show Khashoggi leaving, and they say, we don't have tapes, we only have a live stream, which defies any credibility whatsoever on a security camera. Is there any doubt, Josh, when you put all these pieces together in the mind of U.S. intelligence, that Mr. Khashoggi was in fact murdered?
Nobody wants to come out and say that affirmatively at this point because, you know, they don't have a body to show, and they don't want to rule out hope that he could be still alive. He has a fiancée who's obviously very worried about him. But we have heard no indications at this point from U.S. officials, from Turkish officials, that they think that he is alive and missing somewhere. All the indications from the evidence that is starting to amass in this very unusual case suggests that that he may have been killed after entering the consulate, Willie.
All right, national political reporter for NBC News with that new report this morning. Josh, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
And just to add really quickly to your point about security cameras at the consulate there, I spoke to a person who works for Saudi Arabia. He is familiar with security protocols and diplomatic outposts for the Saudi government. He said it is unheard of that Saudi Arabia would not have security cameras both inside and outside of the consulate, especially in a complex security environment like Istanbul. Right. Turkey is not exactly the safest place on earth. They've had a lot of terrorist attacks. Saudi Arabia involved heavily in Syria. There is no doubt that those security cameras at that consulate would have been working enough to at least substantiate him leaving the consulate at any time, because you could see there's footage of him going in. How could it possibly be that that same exact camera that captured him walking in suddenly was not working, or suddenly somehow broke down in the course of several hours afterwards?
We're telling Senator Corker they don't record, they just live stream. The NYPD can go to any bodega on any block in New York City and get a recording of what happened.
It's just a very tough story to believe.
Senator Murphy, a different topic before we let you go, and ask you about this 24-hour, one-day effort of yours to raise $1 million for pro-gun control candidates coming in the midterms. What's the idea here?
Well, the idea here is pretty simple. We've got to walk and chew gum at the same time. All these other issues are important, but we have a chance to do something really special on the issue of guns. We've got a Republican Congress that won't support universal background checks supported by 90% of the American public. And so we're running this one-day fundraising campaign to raise money for 8 Democratic candidates who are running against A-plus NRA-rated Republican incumbents all across the country. We're trying to raise about $1 million for those 8 candidates, and it's, you know, an effort to show that the anti-gun violence movement is mature, that it's grown up, that it may actually be just as powerful as the gun lobby is in 2018. And so this is the first time that all of these different gun groups, the Moms Demand Action folks, the Giffords folks, and their allies in Congress have gotten together on a big fundraising drive, and it runs through today, and we're hopeful that folks will go on to NR8 and help out these 8 candidates that are going to help us take back the House of Representatives and the Senate from the gun lobby.
Yeah, 7 House seats there, and 1 for Jackie Rosen, who, as we talked about earlier, is in a tight race with Dean Heller in Nevada. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, always good to have you on. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Still ahead, the Dow Jones plunged more than 800 points yesterday, the worst drop in 8 months. We'll talk to Steve Ratner about why that happened and what we can expect today. Morning Joe's coming right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.